All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for the Accelerating Enterprise AI webinar. My name is Jens Eccles. I am the Vice President of Product Marketing here at JFrog. And today I'm going to be joined by Paul Davis, who is our field CISO, who has some deep expertise in security, and Yuval Fernbach, who is the VP and CTO of JFrog's MLOps area. And we're going to be exploring today how we can actually adopt AI better in the enterprise, some possible pitfalls that some of us may be facing as companies, and ultimately, how can we accelerate the usage of AI and get the value of AI in our companies much more quickly? So the reason we're talking today is that JFrog sponsored a report with Information Week. And that report revealed a lot of very interesting findings with some of your peers and professionals in DevOps, operations, and security across North America and Europe to really say, hey, how are we staying secure? How are we staying ahead of the curve when it comes to development of AI solutions, usage of AI in our corporations, generative AI, and then ultimately how we're deploying those out into production and getting those into the marketplace. So we wanted to understand how all of those things were happening, and we'll highlight and bring in some of those statistics for you as we move along, with the goal of giving you some practical approaches to MLOps and MLSecOps so that you can accelerate your AI pipeline. So with that, welcome Paul, welcome Yuval. I will stop sharing on this one for just a moment. Thank you for joining us for this today, gentlemen. I appreciate it so very much. And to get us started, and Paul, maybe I'll actually Yuval, maybe I'll start this first question for you. Enterprise, it's very easy to see that generative AI is changing the way people work, or potentially changing the way people work. They see some value immediately in productivity, but what are maybe some not so obvious benefits and business values that organizations are looking for when they're looking at building AI solutions?
So first of all, that's a great question, and great to be in this webinar. So thank you. It's amazing what GenAI actually have done to the world, or actually what companies have seen now that GenAI actually, started to be existing. Some started to show its value, and I think that many of us sees how it changes some parts of our day to day, from document writing to development to many other use cases. But I think what's really interesting is how GenAI, not just GenAI, any type of machine learning models can actually affect the businesses themselves as well. It's not just chatbot or another interface for a website. And actually what I personally believe is that GenAI is a start. It's an easy way in some cases to add more and more value to products, add another interface, maybe add some more value that's based on external data or even internal data. But it's also allowing companies to see how they can actually leverage models, machine learning as part of their business. And some of the solutions that companies can build are actually not just based on external APIs like OpenAI or GenAI. Many companies actually see now that they can utilize, let's call it classic machine learning models, to deliver other type of values, from recommendation systems to predictions for marketing predictions like churn and lifetime value, to of course many other use cases that can be achieved using any type of machine learning models, and of course GenAI as well.
So I'm going to double click on that for just a second, if I can, Yuval, and continue along that same talk track, which is, I think a lot of companies see things like OpenAI, things like ChatGPT are an easy example. Anything to do with Copilot solutions is an easy example. Why should I not, maybe as a business, just be building my applications to talk to some of these external services and just leave it alone? Like, what's my motivation to control the building and deploying of these solutions for myself?
So eventually the value of any type of model is based on the data that this model actually utilizes. And if you want to actually get business value from any type of model, you must create the right pipelines, the right data processes to enrich that model with your business, with your the data that you actually collected over the years, the data that actually give values to that model that is not just a generalistic, chatbot. So it's not just connecting to external API, sending some questions, getting answers, and eventually knows how to, I don't know, read from a website. It's enriching those questions with internal data, with different architectures like RAGs, or maybe the features of your entities, of your objects in the organization, maybe creating an old pipeline that decide which model is actually better for which specific use case, or even utilize small models and not just sorry for that, not just those large LLM models that built by OpenAI and of course others that are great, but not for any specific use case. So eventually you need to create an architecture, a solution that is built on all data, utilize multiple models, can actually understand which specific question, which specific use case actually fits which model. And I must say that this is a really, really challenging process to do.
If I could add in, it's
Please.
almost sort of learning on as we're learning as we're growing. This solution has accelerated at crazy speed. And it's almost you watch this evolution with customers, okay, I'm going to bring in this Gen AI capability, not realizing that they've been doing machine learning. Many industries have been doing machine learning with natural language and prediction models, etc. But now it is a point where we've reached like a maturity pivot point in the technologies where we're starting to think, what else can we do? And they start off with, hey, it's cheaper for me to use an external solution. But then they start saying, well, I want to use my internal data, which is what Yuval mentioned. We can leverage data inside the company. And then you start to say, actually, I don't want that data escaping out, maybe, or it's just for internal use or whatever. And that kind of evolution around that. And so the business value of these solutions is just growing exponentially. But I also think I'm the security person, so I'm paranoid. So we're also learning how to control it and put the role-based access controls and mechanisms mechanisms to control these generative engines, which can, if you don't control them properly, can go a bit wild, as we've seen there's been many news reports about that. But it is that sort of watching customers evolve their models is quite fascinating as we've customer support. And then obviously in the world of IT security, we're dealing with more and more data, and it runs 24/7 and it just grinds through the data. But we're still learning what's the right thing, what's the right way of leveraging it, and can we trust it? I suppose trust is a big word with that thing. But yeah.
Great. So maybe I'll stick on that tack a little bit, Paul, with the following question. I think a lot of our audience and at large, a lot of development teams, we just use some acronyms and some terms and some thoughts that we've never been exposed to before, right? So you start talking about access control, and I'm with you. You start talking about RAG-based systems, and some of these things are newer to me as a development organization, oftentimes, and yet the demand is there to insert these types of solutions as part of our software development pipeline, and yet you've just spoken a foreign language. So to me, the question is, how is building machine learning and AI-based solutions different than traditional software development in a way that allows me to, yes, explore these new frontiers, but also I have to deliver for the business. So what are the differences that I'm going to be looking at? What's my gap, Paul?
So the great thing is that we have the foundations of the software supply chain. We have that sort of infrastructure in place. But typically we're talking with programs and source code and release cycles and CI/CD and all this kind of stuff. But with AI, as we've been mentioning, data is the key. And that adds another dimension. And that also has its own life cycle, its own heartbeat, its own rhythm of control. And so you almost see sort of they come up, it's almost like they run in parallel, these models, and then they converge. And then ironically, AI keeps going. Whilst in software, we might develop a piece of software, we deploy it, We sit back, we relax, we celebrate, and then we think, okay, what's our next project? Until they come back and said, here's a bug, here's an issue, here's a feature, and then you have to go back and fix that code or do whatever. AI has its own kind of living entity. It is almost living and sounding scientifically sort of like visionary, but it has its own thing where you have to monitor it a different way, and it's not something you can just sit and forget because data gets stale, it starts to drift. It can be attacked many different ways. There are toolkits out there now which are dangerous. So just monitoring all that stuff is scary. But I think what we're sort of seeing is this sort of alignment where all of a sudden we realize data scientists are programming in Python and sort of building stuff, so they're coding things, and you go, ooh, what are our standards there? And then they're starting to use open source functions, and it's almost like it's sort of we have to force that convergence. The people listening to this webinar, you've got to start linking them together so there's a consistency and a connective tissue that brings them together, so you have those controls. I don't know if you, Val, if you had anything to add on to that one, but
Yeah, let me frame up the question for you, Val, because I'm sure you have a point of view. Paul mentioned something there about data scientists and their processes, which again may be totally foreign to a software development team that has simply handed models and some of their dependencies and said, go do. So I don't really understand as a development team what's reaching them every day. And I also don't even understand how they evaluate models today. How are those go through some kind of testing, any kind of like we're used to hearing about regression tests and pen tests and unit tests and all those kinds of things, but I have no idea what people do with machine learning models as a traditional software development team. So how is it different with the persona and the process that those things need to go through?
So first of all, it is different. The process starts with experiment tracking and data processes, feature engineering. It continues with model training. Those steps are not similar to what happens in any kind of like software engineering process. It's not similar to the software development lifecycle, and it doesn't end the same because, again, as Paul said, if a software ends with an artifact that is deployed to production, and basically you don't touch it unless you have a new feature or you found a bug. With models, they degrade over time because data changes over time. But although the process itself is different, and in many companies, in many cases, you actually have different silos between your MLOps that is managed in one way and your DevOps, software development that managed in a different way, using different tools, different processes. The artifacts themselves, the objects that are created in that process are pretty much the same objects because, for example, when you train a model, eventually you get a deployable artifact, and it should be, of course, an immutable artifact. And you need to manage that artifact in the same way that you manage any type of artifact. It doesn't matter if it's a Python code, a Python binary, a Java binary, a Go binary. Eventually, it's a binary that needs to be saved in a central place. It needs to be scanned for vulnerabilities. That binary is dependent on other packages, open sources, internal packages. It doesn't really matter. You need to, of course, manage those packages in a single storage as well. You need to secure those packages. You need to scan for vulnerabilities. So yeah, there are many steps that are different, like model training and like experiment tracking, and like model monitoring that actually monitor the output of the model, evaluate the model. Model testing, the test if a specific model actually reached the right metrics that you want. And by the way, with GenAI, it's way more complicated because what are the metrics? It's how do you know if a model is better than the previous one? By the way, the current standard is to use a different model to test your model, and that's complicated by itself. So the process itself is different, but many steps, especially the steps that create your artifact, create the brain that eventually is in your production system, are quite similar because you have a build process, you have a deployment process. It's pretty much the same. You have external packages. You need to make sure that you do manage those specific processes in the same way and eventually connect those two different silos to be a single, even if it's not a single process, it should be managed in the same way that DevOps can actually manage and security teams can manage as well.
Now you've both given some great insight here, and I'll admit I'm going to put on my security and compliance and legal hats all at the same time. And what you have done is made this sound extremely accessible and terrifying at the same time? Because it sounds like there's a lot of blind spots. In fact, let me go ahead and pull this up while we're talking that shows from this same survey that we talked about before that there are some concerns at organizations such as around data exposure, as you talked before. What data am I exposing, or are these models trustworthy in any reliable way with the malicious code in them? And so, thinking of the applications that are being developed today, companies are using a significant amount of Gen AI and shipping a significant amount of machine learning, but it seems like there's a lot of blind spots and there's a lot of open source tools that are trying to address this. So there's not a formality around this that is being created. So if an organization is early in their journey, like maybe the respondents to this study were, they might be using a bunch of open source tools to generate models. They might be using open source tools to consume models. They might be using open source tools to package these models in the right kinds of ways with the dependencies that are required in data. What are some things that we can do to make this more secure and trustworthy? So I've got things in my head like salsa frameworks and different kinds of SBOM frameworks that are floating around there in traditional development. But what exists, Yuval, I'll direct this at you first, that right now today some of these very same kinds of companies can take advantage of to make sure they're not falling into a trap here?
So first of all, it's a new field, right? So the same standards, the compliances that exist for software development are still in their early days for Gen AI. But although they're in their early days, because Gen AI came into our life as a storm, there are so many different companies and so many organizations and government that actually are building those compliances, are building those standards as we speak. So I do believe that as time goes, there will be more and more standards. And actually, there are some standards that already exist and help companies to start with building their or start with their Gen AI journey. But I do believe that companies first need to understand that they cannot completely block that journey. They need to allow their employees, their developers, and their product to think about the value of Gen AI and start building through that value, start understanding how they can utilize that, but do it in a smart way. For example, again, you said that there are many open sources. I agree, they're not mature enough, but there are solutions that allow you to create the right guardrails to protect against LLM data poisoning, for example, and to allow you to manage your artifacts in a way that is secured and of course make sure that you don't have vulnerabilities in your artifacts. And there are solutions that allow you to make sure that data that you send to the models doesn't include any kind of private or data that you don't want to go out of your organization. So yeah, it's a new field. It's still ungoverned. It still lack the right enterprise-ready tools, but there are tools that exist for many years that allow you to actually protect your data, protect your software, and you need to use those tools for Gen AI the same way that you actually use them for any type of software development.
Now, Paul, what you've all just said, because this is so rapidly changing, the moment our viewers watch this webinar, our information may be outdated, right? This is changing so quickly. The
Yeah.
frameworks are coming at 90 miles an hour. The innovations are coming at 90 miles an hour. How can a company, from a security perspective, from a risk perspective, stay ahead of all of these developments? Because this is a brand new attack vector, and I'm not even familiar with what the endpoint is yet, and yet I know malicious actors are already after me. So what can a company even think about?
So the first thing is to have what I call an adult response to the problem, which is don't just say we're going to block all AI. Developers, data scientists are creative people. We give them technical problems to solve. And if you put something in the way of them, they'll work a way around it. So a big thing about that is making sure that you have that you're being mature about it and realizing, I think, unfortunately, or fortunately, AI is inevitable. And you need to basically, grab the bull by the horns and handle it. And that means the first thing is making sure that you understand how it's being used and where it's being used. You need to have, we talked about infrastructure and the regulations and those sort of things. If you don't have a consistent streamlined pipeline which incorporates, the data thing, it's like a lot of the machine learning stuff is about data cleansing. And data cleansing can mean many different things, from GDPR to the AI records to what's going over in California to in India. There's all different regulations coming through. It's getting fun. But if you don't have that visibility and that control in place, it's going to get more complicated. So start putting together the sort of the focus and the program to start handling it. And you need to have, first of all, an easy way to track where it's happening and who's doing it. And remember, that's sneaky, because sometimes one of your software vendors might provide the ability to add in an API key to automatically allow them to incorporate AI inside their product. Yay, that's scary. And then also through your software developers and training them and teaching them, and then making sure you've got the controls to stop bad coming in. We've talked about malicious LLMs. I must admit, I was playing around, and one weekend I was playing around with the LLMs and just running around, installing them, everything. And then the JFrog threat team went and showed me how that just installing the LLM could infect my computer. Next weekend was spent scanning my computers for any interesting compromises. Luckily, I wasn't taken, but that sort of thing, it's the new target. So you've got to have those pieces. So also the policies. Understand this is a fast moving target. Different parts of the world have different levels of maturity regarding AI. We all know it's a problem. We all know that you shouldn't be using AI for bad activities like automatic facial recognition to identify and socially mine somebody, that sort of stuff. So you just need to do that. And then, as I said, big thing for me is just making sure you've got the visibility. So you understand through all the stages that we've talked through, that you can see where it is, monitoring it, making sure you've got your policies. Licensing is more complex with the AI. That's the stuff. But I've been counseled for this webinar to be positive. This is all good stuff. It's not impossible, but you have to be firm and realize you can't just do this on the back of a napkin. You have to formalize this into a program.
Yuval, I'm going to turn back to you because, as Paul said, we need to be positive for a minute. We don't always need the grumpy security guy.
I'm wearing the positive at today.
But so as we can see on the slide here, there's such a huge variety of adoption, enforcement, where concerns lie. And we know from some of our analyst friends at places like Gartner and Forrester and IDC that bringing models to production is very difficult. So Paul just laid out some of the complexity you have as well earlier in this discussion. So in your opinion, is the security concern what's holding people back from bringing it in production? It's just taking too long? Is it that we don't understand our processes? What's blocking us from getting some of this to realize the value in production from the get-go? What's making us slow?
So actually, in this slide, there is a statistic that 79% of firms say that security is one of the reasons why they're basically blocked from utilizing AI and ML features in their software. But I actually think it's not just security, it's around trust. And security is a big part of trust, right? Because if I don't feel secure, if I think that my models can basically eventually create a new vulnerability to my software, then I don't trust those models, and that's due to security. But I don't think it's just security. Around 10 years ago, many companies that built models, more like the classical models, and I'm talking about the big companies that actually utilized machine learning models years ago, companies like Apple and Netflix and many others, actually had two separate teams, a team that researched models and built actual models, and a separate team that took those models, rebuilt them for production sometimes in different languages, because they didn't trust the research work. and it's all around trust. So and we moved from those phases of separate teams that building models and deploying them to now have basically data scientists that are in charge on the entire life cycle. And I believe that once companies are building the right MLOps, or let's call it Gen AI ops or LLM ops or whatever pipeline, they can add more trust to the process. And security is a big part of this trust, but it's not just security. It's having the adults, as Paul said, that manage that pipeline, is making sure that each step of that pipeline is managed in the right way. It's making sure that you test your models, you evaluate them, and you know what's the value of the model that's currently running in your production. It's making sure that you manage the data that goes through that model, and security is of course part of each one of those steps. So yes, security is part of it, but I think that trust and creating process and thinking about how you can do it in the right way is a bigger concern actually, or the solution to solve that security/trust challenge, I'll call it.
Yeah. And Paul, I want to turn that same topic to you again as the grumpy security guy. I want to bring up a slide that we saw before that has a very interesting statistic in it. And here on kind of the top right, we
Yeah.
see the two biggest concerns that relate to the trust that Yuval was maybe just talking about
Yeah.
is data exposure through LLM usage. Nearly 6 out of 10 companies cite that as their top concern, and malicious code in the models themselves, roughly half of companies. So it's
Yeah.
pretty clear that we're looking at how are we exposing ourselves and what's inside the things maybe that we are consuming. Um, this is interesting because it shows that the mindset is a little bit on getting the sharing the data with the models from the outside, from the external to the organization, perhaps, which aligns with other data that we see from IDC, Gartner, and Forrester. Why is data exposure such a big deal? We've spent a lot of time talking about the models themselves, but why is data exposure such a big deal to these organizations?
Because data is the heart of any organization nowadays. The data is a huge differentiator. An automotive manufacturer. It's not the fact they can produce cars, it's how they design their plants, it's their designs, it's that data, that knowledge of how they build a manufacturing plant that makes them special. Yeah, or many times data is like I want to say it's the sort of the not the heartbeat, but it is the essential thing that flows throughout an organization that makes it special. But it's also very delicate and subject, and it's amorphous. It could be just purely sort of company secrets. See, I told you I was paranoid. Or it could be PII, or it could be, scarily enough, because generative AI is generative, a lot of times we forget that word, that artificial generative intelligence. It's going to get creative and start saying things which aren't strictly true. So by, there are many different attack techniques, as I've indicated. There's a version of the tool similar to Metasploit, which allows us to actually automate attacks against LLMs, models that are exposed through prompt engineering, injection, breaking the guardrails, etc. And so from that perspective, you've got it's scary. So data is really the key of it. Without data, the models don't exist. The trouble is the more data you throw at it, the more problem it could be you're putting secrets in there you don't know. And from that perspective, so I'm almost encouraging red teams, purple teams, blue teams, the security teams which do the pen testing, to now start learn how to do those tests against their own models as well, to see what's going on and expose those things. And in fact, like building the guardrails, it's almost like a hobby. I know some famous CTOs at some famous software companies are spend their weekends creating guardrails to try and break their models, and they're all just discovering new ways of getting around it. It's great fun. Socially engineering LLMs is fun, but yeah. So from that point of view, that risk, that data, and then the fact that is living code that can do things and can execute, especially with AI agents and AI starting to come out with the ability to control your computer. Sorry, I'm getting paranoid. I'm going to shut up. Jens, back to you. Sorry.
Thank you. No, so I think, and thank you for clarifying that a little bit. I think a lot of our development teams in our audience are used to thinking of data security, and we don't want to expose our data specifically, but it gets a little bit more scaled out, like you're talking about when you're exposing your data intentionally or unintentionally to some of these large models. It grows legs and
Yes.
it does things that maybe you did not expect. So it's not just the exposure of the data itself that we're worried about. It's now what is that data informing and what monster may I have created as a result. Very interesting. I'm going to move quick to close us. We've given people plenty of things to talk about, and as a reminder, you can click in that Q&A window and ask questions as you may have heard of some interesting topics or things that you want clarified. And we do have some of our friends on the back side of the webinar software here able to answer some of those for you, and then we can also follow up with you directly. Yuval, what would be a closing if you were saying you've got one, maybe two pro tips for companies that are seriously looking at adopting MLOps best practices within their organization to accelerate the usage of AI in their groups? What are a couple pro tips you might leave our viewers with today?
So I will put my positive ass back, and I think that first of all, you need to think about your MLOps practices the same way that you think about your software development lifecycle. You need to think about how you can create an actual process that you trust, and that process should look as as similar as possible to your SDLC. In terms of the way that you manage the artifacts, in terms of the place where you manage your source code, in terms of how you create immutable objects and not just randomly change the architecture that call an external API, for example. So once companies think about it as a process and look at the from development to production and monitoring and of course back to development, it allows them to, in a way, trust the outcome, trust the model that is created. It's not just a model, it's an application that is created. And by that, eventually making sure that the organization can actually utilize machine learning, utilize Gen AI, and again, trust that process, because I think that trust is what organization need to actually succeed in this specific space.
Great. Paul, last word to you on positive takeaways, perhaps, or some very key pitfalls that we need to make sure people are getting with your pro tip of the day.
So first of all, security people are happy, positive people. I just start that. But the second part of it is, what you've talked about is you need to, you're going to have a standard process, security, reliability, predictability, trust, all those things. The most important thing, your call to action coming out of this is to formalize the program and start bringing in all the people involved in that process, not just the data scientists, not just the developers, not just the ML ops people, but also your infrastructure people. Deploying this stuff is very different. And if there's a disconnect between those teams and you start ending up with siloed models, it's not going to work. And when you get those siloed models, you lose your benefits. So bring the people together from the beginning to the end. Bring those teams together so that you see the full picture and you build a program and you basically teach each other. The world of data scientists is different from the security people. No, we don't wear hoodies and sit in dark corners. Data scientists don't sit there just experimenting with numbers with abacuses on the table. No, we're real human people. We're fun, and same with infrastructure, everybody. Just bring them together and build that program so that you're ready to, as I said, get the end-to-end picture.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so very much for taking some time today. Very enlightening, and I know this is a journey. It's not a magic trick. So thank you very much for your insight. And again, for our viewers today, reminder that you can put those questions and answers in right now. We'll still be on with you for a few minutes, and we'll be following up with you after this webinar with some informational materials and some ways that maybe you can get some more assets, just some more research on how you can build out these programs within your company. With that, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Yuval. And we'll go ahead and wrap up. Cheers.